I still don't like to talk about it much, but it's been eating at me. So here it is. Something that happened when I worked as a pizza delivery driver in a small town. I'm not sure I even want to name anymore. I mean, I've always known this job wasn't glamorous, but that night, there's no way to explain it without sounding insane. I still don't know what happened. It started like any other night. Late shift, no one around, the streets almost deserted. I was working at a small pizza joint, just the usual delivery rounds. I remember the order. It was one of those ones with an address you don't recognize, out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't so far from town, but the road out there was long, dark, and quiet. Always gave me an uneasy feeling, but it was a big order, so I wasn't going to turn it down. I checked the address again before I left. It was one of those big, old houses that looked like it had been standing for ages, kind of decrepit, almost out of place. The porch lights were flickering when I pulled up, and there was no sign of movement, not even a car. Just the faint smell of something burning in the air. I knocked at the door. Nothing. I rang the bell. Still nothing. I'm not the type to leave the pizza on the doorstep, so I stood there a few moments longer. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound from inside. I thought maybe they were trying to get to the door or some dog was scratching at something. But the sound was odd, like something dragging along the floor. I was starting to get a bad feeling. My skin prickled. I felt like I was being watched. I knocked again, this time harder. Finally, the door creaked open. A man stood in the frame, barely visible in the dim light behind him. He looked off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his eyes were dark, hollow. I could barely see his pupils. "You ordered pizza?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. He nodded and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Now, I've done a lot of deliveries in my time, and most customers are at least polite, even if they're a bit odd. But this felt different. Something wasn't right about this guy or this house. I hesitated for a second, but the smell of the pizza and the thought of getting paid for this delivery made me step inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart skipped a beat. "Just set it down on the table," he said, in a voice that was way too calm. It almost sounded like he wasn't speaking to me at all, more like he was speaking to himself. I turned toward the living room. There was no furniture, just an old wooden table in the center, covered in dust. I walked toward it and placed the pizza down, glancing around the room. The walls were peeling, and the air felt thick, like it hadn't been aired out in years. That's when I noticed the pictures on the walls. Old black and white photos of people I didn't recognize. All of them with their eyes scratched out, every single one. I froze. I didn't know what to do. The silence grew heavier, and the man hadn't moved, just staring at me with that unsettling gaze. "Who are these people?" I finally asked, my voice trembling a little. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly turned toward the table, trembling as he picked up the pizza box. The motion was deliberate. He opened it, but the expression on his face shifted. A grin too wide spread across his face, showing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "Not for me," he muttered, his grin fading. "Not for me, but for you." The lights flickered again. I felt a chill run down my spine, and before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. A long, rusty blade. "You're gonna be just like them," he whispered. I didn't think. I bolted. I shoved the door open and ran into the yard, not even caring if I had the pizza anymore. I could hear him behind me, calling out in that strange, rasping voice. His words didn't make sense, but all I knew was I had to get away. I jumped into my car and sped off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing me, but nothing, just the empty road behind me. I never went back to that house. And when I called the cops the next day to report the incident, they said no one had ever lived there. The house had been abandoned for years. I tried to forget about it, but the weirdest thing happened a few weeks later. The pizza place called me in for a special shift, and when I checked the orders that came through, one of them had the same address. I couldn't do it. I couldn't even drive near that road again. But every now and then, I swear I hear that same scraping sound when I'm alone at night, and I can't shake the feeling that the man from that house, he's still out there, waiting. I used to work as a pizza delivery driver, a job that I didn't mind too much. Sure, it had its stressful moments, navigating traffic, dealing with rude customers, and the occasional weird interaction. But most of the time, it was just a simple gig. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened on one cold November night, though. I remember the night clearly because it was unusually quiet, even for a late shift. The restaurant was almost empty, and the kitchen staff was winding down for the night. I was on the last delivery of my shift, a large pizza to a house out in the woods. Normally, we didn't deliver this far out, but the order was placed well before closing, and it was paid in advance. The directions on the receipt were vague, just end of Maple Street, second house on the left. I figured it was just a remote area, no big deal. The drive out there wasn't terrible, but it felt off. It's hard to explain, but there was an odd, oppressive silence as I drove through that stretch of road. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the sound of my tires crunching on the wet road. When I arrived, I noticed the house right away. It was an old, run-down place, the kind you see in movies where you know it's been abandoned for years, but there were lights on inside, so someone definitely lived there. I parked my car and walked up to the front door, noticing that the porch light flickered like it was on its last legs. I knocked. It took a moment, but then the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 30s. He was tall, too tall, with a scruffy beard and an unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I handed him the pizza, and he thanked me in a low, almost raspy voice. But there was something in the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off as just being a little paranoid from being out in the middle of nowhere. Before I could turn to leave, he spoke. "You should come inside for a drink. I have some fresh beer, and you look like you need to warm up." Now, I've been invited inside by customers before. Some offers I've politely declined, others I've accepted for a quick chat. But something about the way he said it made me hesitate. There was no friendliness in his voice, no warmth, just a cold, hollow offer. I told him I was fine, thanked him for the tip, and started to step back. That's when I heard it, a sound from inside the house, a loud thud, followed by what sounded like something scraping across the floor. The man's eyes flickered toward the noise, and for a brief moment, his expression changed. His smile faltered, and his eyes widened in a way that made my stomach twist. He quickly turned back to me and said, "It's nothing, just the house settling. You know how it is." I nodded, but I could tell he was lying. I had seen the way he looked at the door, the way his eyes darted toward the darkness behind it. I took a step back, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But then, before I could make a clean getaway. The door slammed shut in my face. I stood there for a second, confused, but before I could even process what had happened, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and slow, coming toward the door from inside. The man had locked it. I knew because the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was unmistakable. I quickly turned and hurried to my car, my heart racing. As I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw something that made my blood freeze, a shadow moving across the curtains in the second-story window. It was tall, the same shape as the man, but it didn't look like him. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of there, not daring to look back again. I'm not sure why, but something about that house, about the man, told me I wasn't just dealing with someone who lived alone. When I returned to the restaurant, I told my manager about it, and they brushed it off as nothing. Probably just some drunk guy trying to mess with you, they said. I don't think they believed me. Hell, I'm not sure I even believe it myself sometimes. But I've never gone back to that part of town since. I've heard rumors since then. People talk about strange things happening in the woods, about odd figures seen standing in windows at night. People who go there, they disappear. I just hope I never see that man again. I never got his name. I never got a chance to ask who else was living in that house. And to this day, I still wonder if it was him in that window, or if it was someone or something else entirely. I don't know what I saw, but I know I'll never forget that night. It was around 9:45 p.m. on a Friday night when I took the delivery job at this small local pizzeria. I wasn't expecting anything strange. Honestly, it was just another way to make some extra cash. I'd driven that route hundreds of times before, but this one was different. It started like any other order. A call came in for a pizza to be delivered to a house out in the woods, about 20 minutes away from town. At first, I thought it was odd. The house was on the outskirts of the forest, far from any streetlights, tucked behind a long, winding gravel driveway. But, like I said, I'd been there before. It wasn't a huge deal. The address was for a place I didn't recognize, but I wasn't worried. You get used to odd addresses when you work deliveries. The map guided me, and soon enough, I found myself on that desolate road. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The house was completely dark, but it wasn't just the lack of light. There was a weird, suffocating stillness about it. The trees surrounding the place seemed to close in on the house, and the air felt dense, almost thick. I brushed it off. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I pulled up to the house, parked my car, and grabbed the pizza. There was no car in the driveway, no movement, nothing. I stood there for a second, staring at the darkened windows, the only thing visible being a faint glow from a single light in the front room. It wasn't enough to make out anything, but I could tell the curtains were drawn. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I checked the time, 9:58 p.m. The order was supposed to be paid with cash, and I was starting to wonder if maybe they just weren't home. But then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard something from inside. A faint, slow scrape, like someone dragging furniture. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a chill, but I didn't want to look like an idiot in case someone was actually home. So I knocked again, louder this time. And that's when the door opened, just a crack. A thin, pale face peeked out from the darkness. The person looked like they hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. Their eyes were wide, too wide, and their skin was almost sickly white, like they hadn't been eating. I felt my heart race. The person didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge the pizza in my hand. Instead, they just stared at me, blinking slowly, almost unnervingly. I took a step back. Your pizza, I said, trying to make it sound casual. But I could tell I wasn't fooling anyone. The person's hand reached out slowly and took the pizza. But when they grabbed it, they didn't let go immediately. Their fingers felt cold, unnaturally cold, and the way their grip tightened made me feel uneasy, as if they were pulling the pizza in. Not because they were hungry, but because they didn't want me to leave. I froze. "That'll be $22, I said, my voice trembling just slightly, but they didn't respond. The door stayed cracked open, and the hand just hovered over the pizza box, unmoving. I glanced down at their feet, and for the briefest moment, I saw something odd. There was something under their shirt. It wasn't a shirt at all. It was a bag of some kind, like a black trash bag tied around their waist. I could see something shifting inside, something heavy. I could have sworn I saw something moving beneath it. That's when I decided to leave. I pulled the pizza back from their grasp, a bit too forcefully. The person blinked, and a thin, eerie smile spread across their lips. Their eyes didn't shift, but there was something behind that smile, a kind of coldness, like they knew something I didn't. "Thank you for the pizza," they whispered, the words barely audible. Then they slammed the door in my face. I stood there, stunned for a moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something had been very wrong with that house, with that person. I turned to leave, but as I got to my car, I heard something from the corner of my eye, a flash of movement. I whipped around, my stomach sinking. At the window, the curtains had been pulled back just enough to reveal two eyes, staring directly at me. Cold, empty. But they weren't hers. The eyes blinked once and then vanished. I jumped into my car, speeding off before I could even think. The whole drive back to town felt like I was being watched, like someone was behind me, lurking in the trees. When I reached the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror one last time, and for just a split second, I swear I saw something, someone, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I don't deliver to that house anymore, and I'm never going back. But every now and then, when I'm driving home late at night, I can't help but feel like someone's in the woods, just outside my window, watching. I don't know if they're following me, but I can feel them out there.